A few years ago, I worked in the marketing department of a mid-sized company in South America, a place that, at first glance, seemed structured and professional, but slowly revealed a very different reality underneath. The owner was deeply involved in day-to-day operations, and many of the people in management were not necessarily there because of experience or qualifications, but because of long-standing personal relationships with him. They were friends, former classmates, people from his inner circle who had been given positions of authority and influence. This created an environment where loyalty often mattered more than competence, and accountability was unevenly distributed. Another important detail that shaped the entire dynamic was the absence of women in leadership roles. Decisions, tone, and power structures were almost entirely defined by men. Our marketing team consisted of 4 people: the marketing manager, the sub-manager who was my direct boss, me as the marketing coordinator, and one person responsible for audiovisual production. Although we all worked within the same department, the audiovisual role technically reported to me, which made me responsible for overseeing their output and aligning it with broader marketing strategies. At the time, I was 27 years old and the only woman on the team. Both my boss and the audiovisual employee were older than me, which added another layer of complexity to an already imbalanced structure. My boss had joined the company just 1 month before I did. Before this role, his professional life had been very unconventional. He had spent years living in different coastal areas across South America, working as a freelance web designer and taking on remote projects. While that lifestyle may have given him certain technical skills, it did not prepare him for managing a team or operating within a corporate environment. He had no real experience in leadership, organizational processes, or structured marketing strategy. Despite this, he had been given a management role primarily because he was the marketing manager's best friend since childhood. That relationship alone was enough to secure his position. It became clear very quickly that there was a significant gap between his title and his actual capabilities. On paper, he was the one in charge of the department's execution. In practice, I was the one handling the majority of the work. I was responsible for developing marketing strategies, planning campaigns, coordinating with other departments, organizing events, managing timelines, and even overseeing the budget. These were responsibilities that typically belonged to someone in a much higher position, yet they had quietly become part of my daily workload. Meanwhile, my boss's role seemed to revolve around delegating tasks to me, and then presenting the final results as if they were his own contributions. In meetings, he would speak confidently about outcomes and initiatives that I had conceptualized and executed. At first, I tried to rationalize it as part of a learning curve or an adjustment period, but over time it became clear that this was not temporary. It was a pattern. In the beginning, he tried to establish a friendly relationship with me. He positioned himself as approachable and informal, creating a sense of closeness that blurred professional boundaries. However, there was something about it that felt calculated rather than genuine, and it was subtle, difficult to articulate, but consistently uncomfortable. Later, I understood that this friendliness was a strategy. By framing requests in a casual, almost friendly way, he made it harder for me to refuse additional responsibilities. Tasks that were outside my role were presented as small favors or collaborative efforts, which gradually normalized an imbalance in workload. As time went on, my responsibilities kept expanding. Tasks that originally belonged to him or even to my subordinate started shifting toward me. What made this particularly challenging was not just the increase in volume, but the instability of my role. There was no clear boundary, no consistent definition of what I was supposed to be doing. It felt like the expectations were constantly evolving, always in a direction that added more pressure and less recognition. At the same time, the way I was treated began to change. The tone became more critical, less respectful, and increasingly dismissive. Whenever something went well, the credit would go to him. He would present successes as his leadership outcomes. But when something went wrong, even if it was due to decisions he had made or constraints beyond my control, I was expected to fix it. The responsibility was mine, but the authority and recognition were not. Another layer of difficulty came from the dynamic within the team. Although I was technically the supervisor of the audiovisual employee, in practice it often felt like the three of them, the manager, my boss, and the audiovisual employee, were aligned. They shared a level of familiarity and unspoken understanding that excluded me. Decisions would sometimes be made without my input, even when they directly affected my work. It created a situation where I was carrying most of the responsibility while being treated as if I had the least authority. From an external perspective, nothing seemed wrong. My bosses were polite, well-spoken, and maintained a professional image within the company. They knew how to present themselves in a way that made them appear reasonable and approachable. This made everything more difficult because the issues I was experiencing were not visible to others. The manipulation was subtle, often happening in ways that left no clear evidence. One example of this pattern was how approvals were handled. My boss would frequently approve decisions verbally, sometimes even encouraging certain approaches. But later, if something needed to be questioned or criticized, he would deny having approved it. Without written confirmation, it became my word against his. This tactic allowed him to shift blame onto me while maintaining plausible deniability. Things escalated significantly in August. The conflict that emerged that month was not even directly related to work tasks. It started with the way he communicated with me through WhatsApp. His messages became increasingly rude and condescending, crossing a line that had previously only been implied. At one point, he wrote something along the lines of, "I know you're a woman, so this might be harder for you to understand." Comments like that had been made before, but always in person, where there was no record. This time, it was written. I responded in a calm and professional manner. I made it clear that I was fully capable of doing my job, and that requests could be made without disrespect. My intention was not to escalate the situation, but to set a boundary. Later that day, after most people had left the office, he asked me to join him in a conference room. The location itself felt intentional, isolated, private, away from witnesses. Once inside, he began yelling at me. The conversation quickly turned into a stream of insults and personal attacks. He brought up aspects of my personal life that had nothing to do with work, using them as a way to undermine me. I remained calm throughout the interaction. I kept my responses measured and professional, even though the situation was clearly inappropriate. At one point, I responded in a slightly condescending way, subtly reflecting back the tone he was using. It was not aggressive, but it was enough to shift the dynamic. After that moment, things changed even further. During September, the situation intensified. It became increasingly clear that he was trying to push me to resign. The pressure increased in every possible way. More tasks, more criticism, more scrutiny, and a complete disregard for my schedule or boundaries. The environment became exhausting, both mentally and emotionally. However, I made a deliberate decision not to quit. If they wanted me out, they would have to make that decision themselves and face the consequences that came with it. I had already planned to leave the company after completing 1 full year in November. That timeline mattered to me because I wanted to have that experience formally recognized on my resume before moving on to a new opportunity. Then, in October, something happened that changed everything. While working on a project in Figma, I accessed one of my boss's pages to check some information. There, I found a document that had been recently created. It was a detailed plan outlining the restructuring of the marketing department for the following year. As I read through it, it became immediately clear that my role had been completely removed. The responsibilities I had been handling were redistributed across multiple new roles. Even the audiovisual employee, who reported to me, appeared in a newly elevated position that did not align with their experience or the actual needs of the department. It was not just a plan. It was proof. Everything I had suspected over the past months was now clearly documented. I immediately took screenshots, making sure that timestamps and details were visible. That same week, I began noticing additional signs that confirmed my suspicions. They were actively trying to build a case against me. The goal was not just to remove me, but to do so in a way that would justify not paying my benefits. One evening, after I had left work slightly earlier with verbal approval, my boss started sending messages questioning my departure, acting as if he had never approved it. It was an attempt to create a written record that could be used against me. What he did not know was that I already had evidence of a much larger plan. With guidance from my partner, who is a lawyer, I understood that their attempts were weak from a legal standpoint. Leaving early on a single day was not a valid reason for termination with cause. Their strategy relied more on pressure and narrative than on actual legal grounds. I began documenting everything: messages, emails, screenshots, patterns of behavior, inconsistencies, and any evidence that showed the broader context of what had been happening over the past year. I also documented the coordinated actions they were taking in real time. Through a contact in HR, I learned that they were preparing formal statements to present on Friday. These statements would outline reasons why I was supposedly underperforming, supported by selected screenshots that were taken out of context. The plan was to use these documents to justify my termination. They believed they were in control of the situation. They assumed that I was unaware, that I would be caught off guard, that their version of events would go unchallenged. They had no idea that I already knew everything, so on Friday morning, instead of waiting for their plan to unfold, I went directly to the owner. I didn't warn anyone, didn't hint at what I knew, didn't give them time to adjust their strategy. I walked into his office with everything I had collected over the past weeks: screenshots, messages, documentation, timelines. I presented it calmly, step by step, without exaggeration, letting the evidence speak for itself. At first, he seemed confused, trying to understand how everything connected. But as I continued, the weight of the situation became clear. His expression changed from curiosity to disbelief, and then to something closer to embarrassment. It wasn't just about poor management decisions, it was about the culture that had allowed this to happen under his leadership. The favoritism, the lack of oversight, the trust he had placed in people who had clearly abused it. He asked a few questions, mostly to clarify details, but there was no defensiveness in his tone. It was as if he already knew that what I was showing him was undeniable. The documentation was too precise, too consistent, too well organized to dismiss. It showed not only isolated incidents, but a pattern that had developed over time. The manipulation, the shifting of responsibilities, the attempts to undermine my position, the coordinated effort to push me out, and finally, the plan to fabricate a justification for firing me. When I showed him the restructuring plan from Figma, the one where my role had been completely erased, he paused for a moment. That detail seemed to affect him differently. It was tangible proof of intent, not just behavior. It showed planning, coordination, and a clear objective that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with control. He leaned back in his chair, silent for a few seconds, processing everything. The room felt unusually still, as if the entire situation had created a kind of vacuum around us. There was no need for me to fill the silence. I had already said what needed to be said. Then he asked me a simple question: "What do you want to do?" By that point, I was exhausted. Not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. The constant pressure, the need to stay alert, the effort of documenting everything while continuing to perform at work. It had all accumulated. I wasn't interested in staying and trying to fix the environment. I didn't trust that it could be fixed, at least not in a way that would make it a healthy place for me to work. I told him that I wanted to leave the company, but I wanted to do so with my benefits. I wasn't asking for anything beyond what was fair. I just wanted a clean exit, without being forced into a situation where I would lose what I was entitled to. He agreed immediately. There was no negotiation, no attempt to delay or minimize the situation. His response was direct, almost abrupt, as if he wanted to resolve it before anything else could complicate it further. He told me to go to HR and begin the process of formalizing my departure. As I left his office and walked toward the HR department, there was a noticeable shift in how I felt. For months, I had been operating in a constant state of tension, always anticipating the next issue, the next confrontation, the next attempt to undermine me. Now, for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of clarity. The uncertainty was gone. The outcome was defined. In HR, the process began quickly. Papers were prepared, terms were explained, and everything moved with an efficiency that suggested the situation had already been escalated internally. The HR staff member I had previously spoken to avoided unnecessary conversation, focusing instead on completing the formalities. There was an understanding, unspoken but present, that what had happened was serious. While I was in a different part of the building, away from the marketing department, things were unfolding elsewhere. The owner had called my bosses into a meeting. I didn't witness it directly, but later, multiple colleagues described what happened. His reaction was not quiet or contained. He confronted them forcefully, raising his voice in a way that was impossible to ignore. The office layout made it even more visible. The walls were made of glass, designed to create a sense of openness and transparency. In that moment, they had the opposite effect. People could see everything. The body language, the tension, the imbalance of power that had suddenly shifted. For months, those same individuals had operated with confidence, protected by their positions and their relationship with the owner. They had acted with the assumption that their version of events would always be the one that mattered. Now that assumption was collapsing in real time. By the time I returned to my floor to collect my belongings, the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't loud or chaotic, but there was a noticeable difference in energy. Conversations were quieter, more cautious. People were aware that something significant had happened, even if they didn't know all the details. I began packing my things slowly, taking the time to organize everything. Colleagues approached me one by one, some asking if I was okay, others simply offering brief words of support. There was a sense of curiosity, but also a level of respect. The narrative that had been quietly built around me over the past months was no longer the only version of the story. My bosses were not at their desks when I returned. That in itself was unusual. Normally, they would be present, moving in and out of meetings, maintaining their routine. But that day was different. The timing of everything had disrupted their normal patterns. It was around lunchtime. They usually went out together, maintaining their close dynamic outside of work as well. But that day, they didn't leave at their usual time. Instead, they waited. I stayed for about an hour, saying goodbye to colleagues, finishing small details, making sure everything was in order. During that entire time, they remained out of sight. It wasn't until after I had left the office that they finally walked out. That decision, small as it may seem, carried a certain weight. It showed an awareness of the situation, an unwillingness to confront it directly. After months of indirect behavior, subtle manipulation, and controlled narratives, they were now avoiding a direct interaction. The contrast was clear. The same people who had spent weeks trying to pressure me into leaving, who had positioned themselves as untouchable within the company, were now choosing distance. Not out of professionalism, but out of discomfort. For me, that moment was not about confrontation or closure. It was about observation to Farid, watching how quickly dynamics can shift when information changes hands, when assumptions are challenged, when control is disrupted. Over the past year, I had adapted to an environment where I had to constantly prove my value while navigating a system that was not designed to support me. I had taken on responsibilities beyond my role, managed expectations that were never clearly defined, and maintained a level of professionalism even when it was not reciprocated. The experience had required a level of awareness that went beyond the technical aspects of the job. It involved understanding behavior, recognizing patterns, identifying inconsistencies, and knowing when to act. What made the final outcome possible was not a single moment, but a series of decisions, choosing to document instead of react impulsively, choosing to wait until I had enough evidence instead of confronting partial issues, choosing to understand the structure of the situation before making a move. Timing played a critical role. If I had acted earlier, without the Figma document, without the written messages, without the context, the situation could have been interpreted differently. It could have been reduced to a conflict, a misunderstanding, or a difference in working styles. Instead, what I presented was a complete picture, one that showed intent, pattern, and coordination, one that could not be easily dismissed or reframed.
Hmm.
By the end of the process, I had secured what I needed: a fair exit, my benefits, and a documented record of my work. I also left with something less tangible but equally important: a clear understanding of how certain environments operate, how power can be used and misused, and how important it is to recognize when a situation is no longer sustainable. The narrative they had tried to build around me no longer had space to exist in the same way. It had been interrupted, challenged, and replaced with something grounded in evidence. And in that shift, the balance that had once worked against me moved, even if only for a moment, in my favor when I look back at everything that happened. What stands out the most is not just the conflict itself, but the way the entire situation unfolded over time. None of it was sudden. It developed gradually, almost quietly, in a way that made it difficult to fully grasp while I was inside it. At the beginning, everything seemed manageable, even normal. The issues were small, easy to dismiss, easy to rationalize. It's only with distance that the pattern becomes obvious. In the early stages, I spent a lot of time questioning my own perception. I tried to give people the benefit of the doubt, assuming that misunderstandings or miscommunications were temporary. When my responsibilities started expanding, I interpreted it as a sign of trust or growth. It felt like an opportunity to prove myself even if it came with added pressure. I didn't immediately see it as something that could become unbalanced or exploitative. At the same time, the lack of structure in my role made it difficult to set boundaries. There was no clear definition of what belonged to me and what didn't. That ambiguity created space for others to gradually shift responsibilities in my direction without formally acknowledging it. Because everything happened incrementally, there was never a single moment where I could point to a clear change. It was more like a slow accumulation. The interpersonal dynamic played a significant role in reinforcing that process. The way my boss communicated, especially in the beginning, made it harder to identify the underlying intentions. His friendliness blurred the line between professional expectations and personal rapport. Requests didn't feel like orders. They felt like favors. And refusing a favor, especially in a work environment that already lacked clear structure, felt complicated. Over time, I began to notice inconsistencies. The same behaviors that were initially framed as collaboration started to reveal a different purpose. Tasks that were presented as temporary became permanent. Responsibilities that were supposed to be shared became mine alone. And the tone of communication shifted in subtle ways that made the environment feel less supportive and more controlled. One of the most challenging aspects was the lack of visible conflict. From the outside, everything appeared functional. There were no obvious confrontations in public spaces, no dramatic incidents that others could easily observe. The issues existed in conversations, in private messages, in decisions that were made quietly. That made it difficult to seek validation or support from others because there was no clear event to point to. Instead, the experience was defined by a constant sense of imbalance. I was expected to deliver results at a high level while navigating a system that did not fully recognize or support my role. The expectations were high, but the resources, authority, and acknowledgement were limited. That disconnect required a level of adaptability that went beyond the technical aspects of the job. As the months passed, the emotional impact became more noticeable. The uncertainty, the shifting expectations, the need to constantly anticipate potential issues, it created a kind of mental fatigue that was difficult to articulate. It wasn't just about workload. It was about the environment in which that work existed. At a certain point, I began to shift my approach. Instead of trying to fix the situation through direct communication, I started observing more carefully. I paid attention to patterns, to repeated behaviors, to the way decisions were made and justified. I stopped assuming that things would naturally improve and started considering the possibility that the structure itself was the issue. That shift in perspective was important because it allowed me to detach, at least partially, from the emotional aspect of the situation. Instead of reacting to each individual incident, I started looking at the bigger picture. I began to understand that what I was experiencing was not random or accidental, but part of a consistent pattern. Documentation, became a key part of that process. At first, it was not a formal strategy, but rather a way to keep track of things that felt inconsistent. Messages, approvals, changes in direction, small details that, on their own, might not seem significant, but together formed a clearer narrative. Over time, that documentation became more intentional. It changed the way I interacted with the situation. Knowing that I was keeping a record created a sense of structure in an otherwise unpredictable environment. It also provided a form of clarity. Instead of relying on memory or interpretation, I had concrete references that showed how things had evolved. The discovery of the restructuring plan marked a turning point, but it was not the beginning of my awareness. It was the moment when everything I had been observing became explicit. It confirmed that the direction I had sensed was real and that the changes were not just incidental but planned. After that, my actions became more deliberate. I was no longer trying to adapt to the environment or make it work. I was preparing for an outcome. That preparation involved not only gathering evidence, but also understanding the context in which that evidence would be interpreted. It required thinking ahead, considering possible scenarios, and choosing the right moment to act. Timing was critical. Acting too early would have meant presenting an incomplete picture, one that could be questioned or reframed. Waiting too long could have allowed their plan to move forward without interruption. Finding the balance between those two extremes required patience and careful observation. The involvement of my partner with a legal background added another layer of perspective. It helped me understand the situation, not just from an emotional or professional standpoint, but from a legal one. That distinction was important because it clarified what actually mattered in terms of consequences and rights. It also reinforced the importance of evidence. In an environment where narratives can be shaped and influenced, having clear, documented proof becomes a form of protection. It shifts the conversation from opinion to fact, from interpretation to verification. By the time everything came together, the situation was no longer uncertain. The elements were in place, the patterns were clear, and the risks were understood. What remained was the decision of how and when to act. Looking back, one of the most significant aspects of the experience is how it changed my understanding of workplace dynamic. It highlighted how power structures can operate in subtle ways, how influence can be exercised without being immediately visible, and how important it is to recognize those dynamics early. It also showed me the limits of individual effort in an environment that lacks structural fairness. No matter how much work is done, how much responsibility is taken on, or how professionally one behaves, there are situations where those factors are not enough to create a balanced or sustainable environment. At the same time, it reinforced the value of awareness. Being able to observe, analyze, and understand what is happening beneath the surface is a skill that becomes essential in complex environments. The experience also reshaped the way I think about boundaries, not just in terms of workload, but in terms of communication, expectations, and self-perception. It made it clear that boundaries are not always defined externally. They often need to be established internally and reinforced consistently. There is also something to be said about the role of patience. In a situation that feels unfair or unbalanced, the instinct to react immediately can be strong. But sometimes, waiting, observing, and preparing can lead to a more effective outcome. It allows for a response that is not only justified, but also supported by evidence and context. At the same time, patience does not mean passivity. It is an active process, one that involves continuous evaluation and adjustment. It requires staying engaged with the situation while maintaining enough distance to see it clearly. Another important aspect is the distinction between perception and reality. In environments where narratives are controlled, what people believe can differ significantly from what is actually happening. That gap can influence decisions, reputations, and outcomes. Suppose understanding that dynamic is crucial, especially when navigating situations where visibility is limited. The process of documenting and eventually presenting everything created a shift in that dynamic. It introduced a different perspective, one that was grounded in evidence rather than perception. It challenged the existing narrative and created space for a more accurate understanding of the situation. In the end, what remains is not just the outcome, but the process that led to it. The gradual realization, the shift in perspective, the decision to document, the careful timing, and the final action, all of these elements contributed to a resolution that, while not easy, was aligned with what I needed at that moment after everything was over. What stayed with me was not just the sequence of events, but the clarity that came afterward. When you are inside a situation like that, everything feels immediate and consuming. Your focus is on navigating each day, responding to what is in front of you, managing the pressure without fully stepping back to see the structure of what is happening. But once you are out of it, there is space to process, to connect details that once felt isolated, and to understand how each piece fit into a larger pattern. There was a period of adjustment that followed. Even though I had left on my own terms and with everything I needed, the intensity of the experience did not disappear immediately. It took time to recalibrate, to move away from that constant state of alertness. For months, I had been paying attention to every interaction, every message, every shift in tone. That level of awareness does not simply turn off. It lingers, shaping how you interpret new situations, at least for a while. At the same time, there was a sense of regained control. The uncertainty that had defined my day-to-day experience was gone. Decisions were no longer being made in a space where I had limited visibility or influence. The outcome had been shaped by deliberate choices, not by reaction or pressure. That distinction mattered more than anything else. Looking back, one of the most important realizations was how easily environments like that can normalize certain behaviors. When something happens repeatedly, especially in subtle ways, it can start to feel like part of the structure rather than a deviation from it. Small acts of manipulation, dismissive comments, shifting expectations, on their own, they can be rationalized or minimized. But over time, they accumulate and create a dynamic that is far from neutral. Understanding that accumulation was key. It explained why the situation felt heavy even when individual moments did not seem significant enough to justify that feeling. It was not about one interaction or one decision. It was about the consistency of a pattern that gradually shaped the environment. Another aspect that became clearer with time was the role of perception. In many workplaces, especially those with strong internal alliances, perception can carry as much weight as reality. The way people present themselves, the narratives they reinforce, and the relationships they maintain can influence how situations are interpreted by others. In that context, being technically right is not always enough. Without visibility or support, facts can be overshadowed by perception. That is why documentation became so important. It was not just about protecting myself. It was about creating a version of events that could stand independently of interpretation. It allowed me to present a coherent narrative that was grounded in evidence rather than opinion. In an environment where information is often filtered through relationships, that kind of clarity becomes a powerful tool. There was also a shift in how I understood professional identity. Before that experience, I associated professional value primarily with performance, how well I executed tasks, how effectively I contributed to outcomes, how consistently I delivered results. While those elements are still important, I came to see that they are not the only factors that define how someone is positioned within a workplace. Context matters, structure matters. The way roles are defined, the way authority is distributed, and the way communication flows all influence how work is recognized and valued. In a balanced environment, those elements align in a way that supports performance. In an unbalanced one, they can distort it. Well, that realization changed how I approached new opportunities. It was no longer just about the role itself, but about the environment in which that role existed. I became more attentive to how teams were structured, how decisions were made, and how communication was handled. Questions that I might not have considered before became essential. There was also a deeper awareness of boundaries, not just in terms of workload, but in terms of responsibility and accountability. Taking on additional work can sometimes be framed as initiative or commitment, but without clear boundaries, it can lead to a situation where expectations expand without recognition or support. Learning to distinguish between those scenarios became an important part of moving forward. Trust was another element that required recalibration. The experience did not eliminate my ability to trust, but it made it more intentional. Instead of assuming that professional relationships would naturally align with fairness or mutual respect, I became more observant. Trust became something that developed over time based on consistent behavior rather than initial impressions. At the same time, it reinforced the importance of self-trust. During the earlier stages of that experience, there were moments when I questioned my own interpretation of events. The lack of visible confirmation, the subtlety of the behavior, and the external perception of normalcy all contributed to that uncertainty. Learning to trust my own observations, even when they were not immediately validated by others, became a critical part of navigating the situation. That internal confidence did not come from a single moment. It developed gradually, supported by the process of documenting, reflecting, and eventually seeing those observations confirmed. It changed the way I approached ambiguity, making it easier to recognize when something felt inconsistent, even if I could not immediately explain why. There was also an understanding that not every situation can be resolved from within. Sometimes, the structure itself limits what is possible. In those cases, the focus shifts from trying to fix the environment to finding a way to exit it in a way that preserves your position and well-being. That distinction can be difficult to accept, especially when effort and commitment have. The decision to leave, in that sense, was not just about the immediate circumstances. It was about recognizing the limits of what could be changed and choosing a path that aligned with longer-term stability. It required stepping away from the idea that persistence alone could resolve the situation. Another important takeaway was the role of timing and preparation. Acting without preparation can lead to outcomes that are uncertain or incomplete. Waiting without purpose can allow situations to deteriorate further. Finding the balance between those two requires awareness, patience, and a clear understanding of what is needed to support a decision. In that experience, preparation involved gathering evidence, understanding the legal context, and observing the behavior of others. It was not a passive process. It required consistent attention and a willingness to engage with the situation, even when it was uncomfortable. When the moment to act came, it was not driven by emotion alone. It was supported by a foundation that made the outcome more predictable. That did not eliminate the stress of the situation, but it reduced the uncertainty. There is also something to be said about how quickly dynamics can shift when information changes. The same individuals who once held control over the narrative found themselves in a position where that control was no longer absolute. The introduction of evidence disrupted the balance, creating a different set of possibilities. That shift did not happen gradually. It was immediate, tied to a specific moment where the information became visible to someone with the authority to act on it. It showed how much of the previous dynamic had depended on limited visibility rather than inherent stability. At the same time, it highlighted the importance of choosing the right channel for that information. Sharing it with the appropriate person at the right time ensured that it would be taken seriously and addressed effectively. In a different context, the same information might not have had the same impact. What followed was not about confrontation or validation in a traditional sense. It was about resolution. The outcome aligned with what I needed, but it did not require ongoing engagement with the people involved. In some ways, that distance made the transition easier. The experience, taken as a whole, reshaped the way I interpret professional environments. It introduced a level of nuance that goes beyond surface-level observations. It emphasized the importance of structure, communication, and awareness. And it reinforced the idea that not all challenges are meant to be solved from within the same space in which they arise with more distance from the situation. The experience began to take on a different kind of meaning, one that extended beyond the immediate context of that specific company. It became less about what happened there and more about what it revealed regarding patterns that can exist in many workplaces. The details may vary from one environment to another, but certain dynamics tend to repeat themselves, especially in organizations where structure is influenced heavily by personal relationships rather than clearly defined systems. One of the most noticeable patterns was how easily roles can become distorted when there is no clear accountability. Titles exist, responsibilities are assigned. But in practice, the distribution of work and authority can shift in ways that are not officially acknowledged. This creates a disconnect between what is visible on paper and what actually happens on a daily basis. When that gap exists, it opens the door for situations where one person carries a disproportionate amount of responsibility without receiving the corresponding recognition or authority. In my case, that imbalance developed gradually, supported by a lack of oversight and reinforced by the relationships between those in management. Because the people involved had long-standing personal connections, there was an implicit level of trust that was not necessarily based on performance. That trust allowed certain behaviors to go unquestioned, even when they had a direct impact on the functioning of the team. At the same time, the absence of diverse perspectives in leadership played a role in shaping the environment. When decision-making is concentrated within a group that shares similar backgrounds, experiences, or viewpoints, it can limit the range of considerations that inform those decisions. It can also create blind spots, particularly in situations that involve power dynamics or interpersonal behavior. Fifth, the comments that were directed at me, especially those that referenced my gender, were not isolated incidents. They were part of a broader context in which certain attitudes were normalized or overlooked. Even when they were not expressed openly, they influenced how interactions were framed and how authority was exercised. Another important aspect was the way informal communication channels were used to manage expectations and responsibilities. Conversations that should have been documented were often kept verbal. Decisions were made in passing without formal confirmation. This created a level of ambiguity that could later be used to shift responsibility or reinterpret events. In environments where documentation is inconsistent, control over the narrative becomes more flexible. What is remembered can be reshaped, what is acknowledged can be denied, and what is expected can be redefined. That flexibility benefits those who are in positions of authority, especially if there are no mechanisms in place to ensure consistency. Recognizing that pattern changed the way I approached communication. It highlighted the importance of creating records, of confirming decisions in writing, and of maintaining clarity even when others preferred ambiguity. It also showed how something as simple as a written message can become significant when context is challenged. There was also a broader realization about how pressure can be applied in ways that are not immediately visible. It is not always direct or explicit. It can take the form of increased workload, shifting expectations, subtle criticism, or the gradual removal of support. These elements, when combined, can create an environment that feels increasingly difficult to navigate, even if no single action appears severe on its own. That kind of pressure can be particularly effective because it is difficult to isolate. It does not always produce clear evidence, and it can be interpreted in different ways depending on perspective. This makes it harder to address through traditional channels, especially in organizations that rely heavily on perception and informal relationships. The attempt to create a formal reason for my dismissal was an extension of that dynamic. It represented a shift from subtle pressure to a more structured approach, but it still relied on the same underlying principles: control of information, selective presentation of evidence, and the assumption that the narrative would not be challenged. What disrupted that process was not just the existence of evidence, but the completeness of it. Having isolated examples might not have been enough, but having a consistent record that showed a pattern over time made it more difficult to reinterpret or dismiss. That experience reinforced the importance of thinking in terms of patterns rather than isolated events. It is easy to question individual incidents, to wonder if they are being misinterpreted or taken out of context. But when those incidents form a consistent sequence, they begin to tell a clearer story. Another takeaway was the role of internal support, even in limited forms. The HR contact who provided information, even indirectly, played a part in shaping the outcome. It showed that even within environments that are not fully balanced, there can be individuals who recognize inconsistencies and choose to act, even if their actions are constrained by their position. That kind of support may not always be visible or direct, but it can influence how situations develop. It also highlights the importance of building connections that are based on mutual understanding rather than hierarchy alone. There was also a shift in how I viewed conflict. Before that experience, conflict often felt like something to be avoided or resolved quickly. But in that context, avoiding conflict would have meant accepting a situation that was not sustainable. Addressing it required a different approach, one that was less about immediate resolution and more about strategic positioning. Conflict, in that sense, became something to be managed rather than eliminated. It involved understanding when to engage, when to observe, and when to act. It required a level of detachment that allowed for clearer decision making, even in situations that were personally challenging. The outcome itself also provided insight into how authority functions within organizations. The owner's reaction demonstrated that, despite the autonomy given to managers, there were still boundaries that could not be crossed without consequence. However, those boundaries only became relevant once the information reached him in a form that could not be ignored. Now, this highlights the importance of access. Knowing who has the authority to act and how to reach them effectively can be as important as the information itself. In hierarchical structures, not all channels carry the same weight, and choosing the right one can determine the outcome. At the same time, it showed that authority does not always equate to awareness. The owner was not initially aware of what had been happening, which allowed the situation to develop unchecked. This gap between authority and awareness is something that can exist in many organizations, especially those that rely heavily on delegated trust. Understanding that gap changes how situations are approached. It suggests that in some cases, the issue is not just behavior at a certain level, but also the lack of visibility at another. Addressing the situation then becomes not only about presenting evidence, but about bridging that gap. Another element that became clearer was the concept of professional reputation. In environments where narratives can be shaped internally, reputation is not always based solely on performance. It can be influenced by relationships, communication styles, and visibility. Protecting that reputation, therefore, involves more than just doing the work. It involves ensuring that the work is visible, that contributions are acknowledged, and that inconsistencies are addressed when they arise. It also involves recognizing when an environment does not provide the conditions necessary for that reputation to be accurately reflected. The experience also reinforced the idea that leaving a situation does not necessarily mean losing. In many cases, it can represent a strategic decision to preserve long-term stability and growth. The way that departure is managed can influence how that transition is perceived, both internally and externally. By approaching the situation with preparation and clarity, the outcome was not defined by the conflict itself, but by the way it was resolved. That distinction matters because it shifts the focus from what happened to how it was handled. Over time, the experience integrated into a broader understanding of professional environments. It became one reference point among many, but one that carried a significant level of detail and insight. It informed future decisions, influenced how new situations were evaluated, and provided a framework for recognizing patterns more quickly. Rather than being defined by the negative aspects alone, it became a source of information, a way to understand how certain dynamics operate, how they can be identified, and how they can be addressed when they arise.